What up everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Forever Backlogged, the show where I review my gaming backlog as I go through it for your viewing pleasure. Now being that this is the very first episode, I wanted to start off with something a little special, and not only is this a big name game, a name that I'm sure you'll recognize, but it's also something I have a bit of a personal history with. This is a game that's been burning a hole in my backlog, searing a hole in my backlog. Eroding! Yeah, you get the idea. Now this is the part where I like to have a big dramatic reveal, but you've already seen the thumbnail of the video, you've seen the title of the video, so you already know what's coming. But you know what? Let's have a big dramatic reveal anyway. I've worked hard on this, I want to self-indulge a little bit. I feel like I need to be appreciated. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII. Not a whole lot you can say to introduce this game. This is a very much a marquee title in the history of gaming. One of the most, if not the most recognizable JRPGs ever made. Final Fantasy VII was actually responsible for introducing a lot of people to that JRPG genre for the first time and to the Final Fantasy series as a whole. A series that had not enjoyed much success outside its homeland prior to this release. In fact, 7 was the first game in the main Final Fantasy series to be released in Europe. And let me see what else I can read off Wikipedia here. It's one of those games that even without playing it, you're probably very much aware of it, aware of its mark in gaming history, aware of its mark in gaming culture. It's still very much a revered title to this day. Okay, so previously I mentioned I had a bit of a history with this game, so story time. I actually got this game on its release when I was 9 years old. Way back in the day here in Portugal, we had this show on TV about video games, and this was like the biggest mainstream piece of video games coverage we had at the time. Now, as a kid, that show was absolute gospel to me.
Assim que as receberam, estando perfeitamente
So when they come out with their review, raving about this game, giving it a near perfect score, guess what happened? And it wasn't just a review, merely by showing actual game footage. I mean, you have these bigger than life characters wielding giant swords, casting magic spells, summoning giant monsters to fight other giant monsters. That's all it took for 9-year-old me, I was sold. Okay, so by now you've added up that I started this game almost 20 years ago and only now finished it. But that's not even the worst part. What happened is, I actually ended up starting this game over a lot, and every time I would lose my progress. I must have played through the first hours of Final Fantasy VII at least some 8 odd times. Something would always happen, like I would lose my save games, I would lose my memory card, my original CD actually broke, even on different platforms. I remember it starting on PC as well. I lost that save game as well. I mean, this game started to feel like the bane of my gaming existence. I even played other Final Fantasies all the way through before ever managing to get this one to the end. Now what that did is, it increasingly demotivated me to actually get through the game. In a game such as this, you can imagine what the first hours are like. What is in reality a superb introduction to the storyline and its characters turns into the chore of having to button mash your way through walls of text you've already read time and time again. You can imagine what that does to your actual motivation towards finishing the game. It always stuck with me that I should finish this game once and for all, but I became increasingly weary after starting it over all those times. So I decided to try for one last go at it, and what got me through it was grabbing it on my PSP, so during my commute I could soldier through that introduction once again and only then transferring it back to my PS3. While playing it this time around, I actually managed to also get a physical copy to replace that one I had lost as a kid. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the caveats you might face with trying to pick a game like this now, specifically this game, and there are really 3 that I want to talk about. Number 1, the visuals. One thing that was a big deal at the time was that Final Fantasy VII was the first in the main series to actually have a pre-rendered 3D graphics as opposed to the 2D sprites of old. Looking back on it now, what was one of the bigger milestones that the game accomplished, and really one of its bigger selling points, is now seen as more of a weird transitional phase, especially when you compare it to both Final Fantasy VIII and IX, which also came out on the same console just years later. Now this wasn't a big deal for me personally. Like I said, sort of grew up with this game, but I also feel that this used to be a bigger issue with people just a couple years back. This just might be my impression, but I feel as though the gaming audience has matured to the point of appreciating older game design better now as products of their respective time periods, especially with the onset of indie development, which a lot of times delves into that nostalgia and emulates that retro feel. At least to me it feels like before I used to see a lot more people being vocal about how they were turned off by the graphics and the look of Final Fantasy VII.
Because of the low poly.
As opposed to what I hear now, but again, that just might be my impression. Also, if you manage to get over that initial hump, that initial reaction you have to the overworld animations, I believe you'll end up finding the charm behind it all, behind those animations, stiff as they may be. Also, if you feel like that's too big an issue for you to overlook, you can always look into some high-def PC mods with updated graphics. However, I can't personally vouch for any of those as I know very little about what's out there myself. Number 2. Spoilers. Here you have a game that's such a mainstay in gaming culture that trying to finish Final Fantasy VII now without at least being aware of some of its key story points, none of which I'll talk about so as not to spoil, I would equate that to trying to, I don't know, watch any of the old Star Wars movies now without knowing that Vader is Luke's father. And number 3, unrealistic expectations. To this day, this game is still so highly regarded by so many people. It's still seen as an absolute classic. Now, what that can do is it can set some very unrealistic expectations in the minds of newcomers, which might deter them from the gaming experience. They can set an expectation that this game, or no game from that matter, can meet, which would be a terrible shame. I feel those 3 will be the bigger issues you'll face when trying to play through this game today. Outside of its presentation, everything else mechanics-wise is pretty much timeless. Okay, so onto my actual experience. Despite all the build-up I had personally building up for this game over the years, I've still found myself really enjoying the journey, and this game is very much a journey like you'd expect. I thought the cast of characters was wonderfully diverse, probably more so than any other Final Fantasy I've played so far. And the game world, while I could talk about how well fleshed out it is, what really stuck with me was how fun it was to feel part of that setting, of that world, just how fun it was to explore and discover and be immersed in. Also, what I felt really added to the overall experience was how self-aware the game is, meaning it takes itself very lightly for the most part, while reserving the ability to get real dark and gritty at just the right moment, at just the right time, which only make those moments all the more impactful when they actually do come up. That's something I found they really struck a perfect balance on when making this game. As for gameplay, it still very much holds up without a doubt. I mean, like I said, these are timeless game mechanics. They even sound simple enough when you describe them. You get your party members, you level up, you equip better stuff, get better spells, you know the drill. But they're still very fun, and for my money pulled off especially well in this installment. It didn't even feel there was a lot of grinding involved. If anything, you can look at the outcry that there is nowadays that there aren't enough games of this genre, enough turn-based styled RPGs being put out at all. I also had a lot of fun getting through the plot. You always feel both a sense of urgency and a sense of purpose for your actions and where the story takes you, for the most part anyway. And even though the story itself commits a bit of a cardinal sin near the very end, it's not enough to cheapen the whole experience, which I liked very much. Also, the plot actually touches on a couple points that you might feel are even more relevant in the present day, but again, I want to spoil as little of it as possible for you. Also, I have to mention the soundtrack. So I mentioned the graphics before, and also how lightheartedly the game takes itself for the most part. You feel like the brunt of the responsibility for getting you immersed in that world falls on the soundtrack's shoulders, and it pulls it off beautifully. The way it molds every situation and the ambience for you, it's one of those games that stay with you to such a degree that if you go back and listen to the soundtrack after you finish the game, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to pinpoint all those moments throughout the game. What piece of music accompanied what during the game. Now, if if you ask me to get into some of the finer points of how the game plays today, some of the nitty and gritty, I would mention that this installment of Final Fantasy would be particularly good for newcomers, as the battle mechanics and the game mechanics strike a perfect balance between being easy to pick up, easy to learn, and still being fun to master well into the later stages. It will also accommodate your playstyle by letting you deviate as much or as little as you want from the main story arc, and trust me, there's plenty to get you sidetracked if you so wish. With all of that in mind, what do I recommend? Should you move it up your backlog, down your backlog, or somewhere in between? Wait, that sounded a lot better in my head. Okay, so my recommendation is this, and bear with me, I know this is going to sound weird, which is play it if you want to play it. I know, okay, let me explain. You should play this game for yourself, not over some sense of responsibility because of the weight that the name of this game carries. I guarantee you will find reasons to nitpick and hate this game and eventually put it down if you go into it with sort of a checklist mentality. It's really not a big deal to let this one slide if it's just not your type of game. This game will ask for a pretty heavy investment from you in terms of game time, so you would really be doing yourself a disservice by going for it merely because of its classic status. On the flip side, if Final Fantasies are your thing, or just JRPGs in general, and you finally want to pick up one of the great ones, or even if you've never played something like this before, if you have just any inclination that you might like a game like this, by all means go for it. You can't go wrong with this one. Now, me recommending that you move it up your backlog rather than leaving it in the back burner has a lot to do with the spoiler aspect I mentioned before. The longer you put it off, the bigger the risk you run of having the biggest and most important plot points and twists spoiled for you, with it being such a popular game and all. Yeah, you've noticed I'm not big into spoilers. Then again, if spoilers aren't that big of an issue for you, then yes, I would say save it for when you finally want to try it. I don't see it getting any more dated than it already is now. If, like me, you would like to go into it as fresh as possible, I would say give it a shot sooner rather than later. I would also say, though, do make time for it. I mean, this is a game that really excels when you allot yourself some time and some breathing room to take in the full experience and to take in everything the game has to offer. And it is a lot. Even if you're looking to get into it as soon as possible, do plan ahead and do plan on giving it some time. And lastly, I want to mention this again. Do manage your expectations. For the most part, I do think this game warrants the classic status it enjoys, but also in regards to some of the expectations some other people can set for you. Being that first journey counts for a lot. Now, as I said in the beginning of the video, this was a lot of people's first foray into this type of game, and you can imagine the role that plays on nostalgia. What I mean is, not only was this game critically acclaimed when it first came out, it's been firmly nested in the heart of all its fans for all these years, and that too can help set an expectation level that might hinder your experience with it. I mean, I would have a hard time arguing for Final Fantasy VIII as my favorite outside of it being the first one I ever finished and the memories I still hold of playing through it as a kid. I guess what I'm really trying to say is you'd be doing yourself a disservice if you set this game on too high a pedestal before you even play it. I guess I'm trying to stress that I was still able to have a lot of fun with this game, even with my bumpy history with it, and also trying to avoid spoilers for all these years. So I still think there's plenty of room for new players to come in and enjoy it also. Now, I also do want to mention the elephant in the room, which is earlier this year, Square Enix finally announced that they're putting out a fully fledged remake of Final Fantasy VII. Yeah, you might have noticed the internet collapsing for a second there. I know this makes recommending the original a bit harder now, but then again, I don't have to tell you how much modern remakes of classics tend to go completely bonkers. Now, this is not me trying to say from the get-go that a remake won't live up to the original. On the contrary, I'm actually fairly optimistic about the remake, but I still feel like the magic should be experienced for the first time on the original. And who's to say that the remake will look to take over completely from the original? They might end up changing a lot of stuff. Some higher-ups at Square were actually quoted as saying something like, why wouldn't we take the opportunity to change a couple of things? And that's neither good nor bad. Again, I believe you'll get the most out of it by playing the original first and then the remake if you enjoyed it. Plus, it might even turn out that the remake ends up taking a big steamy dump all over the original. I'm fairly hopeful it won't, but you never know. So there you have it, guys. This was the very first episode of Forever Backlog. Thank you so much for sticking it out till the end. Seeing as this is the very first episode, I welcome any and all feedback. I really want to hear what you guys thought about it. I welcome any feedback, any tips you guys have for me improving the content, and also anything that you like me covering in the future. I'm also very open to suggestions. Specifically about this one, if you've gone through Final Fantasy VII already, I'd like to know what your experience with the game was like, and how early or how late, like me, into its release you actually finished it. Or if, on the other hand, you have not ever played Final Fantasy VII, I'm kind of interested in seeing if hearing me talk about it has actually pushed you in that direction. Like I've been saying throughout the video, for me it felt very much like catharsis getting to finally finish a game that I started so long ago. And if I could boil down my entire review, it would go something like this. Take away the dated visuals, and everything that made this game such a riveting experience and such an instant classic is very much still there. The experience is still well worth it. And I feel I'm much better off deciding to go at it one last time and actually finishing it than I would have if I had decided to put it down and never giving it another shot. That's it, guys. Leave a like in the video if you've enjoyed it at all. I got a couple more episodes lined up for the very near future. You can subscribe to the channel. Again, every bit of feedback will be very much appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, everybody. I will see you very soon. Bye. 13, 13.2, you name it. You name it.